Okay, so what I'd like to do for the last little bit here, and I think this will, so what I want to do for the last bit here is, right, so what we were talking about for the last 50 minutes or so is the relationship between numerical identity and this idea of indiscernibility, right? Similarity. So the final thing I want to talk about is the relationship between identity and necessity. And it's really just a question of the kind of modal status of identity claims. So suppose that we have an identity claim, right? Kent is Superman. If that's true, is it necessarily or merely contingently true? So just as a reminder, contingency means it's possibly true and it's possibly false. Whereas necessarily true means, well, it's true, right? It's always true. It must be true. It's true in every possible situation, every possible world. Now, the place to start is, it seems really plausible that identity statements are merely contingent. So just take the first man to walk on the moon is Neil Armstrong. This is an identity claim. It relates a definite description, the first man to walk on the moon, and a proper name. It says they're identical. And it's really clear that this could have been false, right? Just have Buzz be the first one to get off the lander rather than Neil. Buzz Aldrin being the second man to walk on the moon, right? He could have shoved Neil out of the way and gone down and been like, haha, number one, motherfucker. But note that this identity statement features a definite description, right? The first person to walk on the moon, the F, and a proper name. So cool, those seem really easy to make contingent. Could we have an identity statement featuring two proper names? That's true, but merely contingent. So, right, take Kent and Superman, Clark Kent and Superman, with two proper names on either side of the identity claim. Again, let's assume that's true. If it's true, is that kind of claim contingent? Note that, again, it has a different structure than this. And here it gets harder, right? Here it gets harder. And there's a really interesting debate to be had here. So let's focus just on these kinds of ones with proper names. No definite descriptions here. Now, it's notable that Ruth Barkin Marcus and Saul Kripke have offered an argument that these kinds of claims must be necessary if true. And this argument's going to hinge on two principles, two assumptions. The first one's one that we saw already, which is just this, right? If two things are identical, then they share properties. Yeah? Which, again, no one was really doubting this. This is a kind of substitution. And the second assumption is that every object is necessarily self-identical. That is, it's a necessary truth that everything is identical to itself. Note that this doesn't talk about any particular individual. This just seems true, right? Everything is what it is and nothing else. Okay? Now, these two assumptions, we can give a quick and dirty argument for the necessity of identity. Okay? Now, you don't have to memorize this argument, but I'm going to run it by you. Okay? Here's how the argument goes. We take our two assumptions. The first one is, again, this principle of substitution. And the second one is just this principle that everything is necessarily self-identical. And then we plug in the property of being necessarily self-identical as F. So for all x and for all y, if they're identical, well, then they're necessarily identical to themselves. And then we can just simplify, because this is trivial. So we don't need the antecedent here. We can erase it effectively. And we get this. And this tells us, for any two things, if they're identical, then they're necessarily so. Again, you don't have to know this argument, but this is the kind of thing in the background. It's very plausible. It's basically a version. Remember earlier I said that there was this too cheap way to make this true? This is using the too cheap move in reverse. Because everything is necessarily self-identical, so then if that's a property, we can plug in the other variable and get this claim at the end. It's a fun little substitution. It is a dirty logical trick. But if this argument's valid, then identity claims turn out to be necessary if true. And note, this only works if these are names, proper names. So there's a logical reason to think that if identity claims are true, they're necessarily true. But there's, yeah, please.
So because x is x, and that's necessarily true, that's why x is y is also necessary.
Yeah. So basically the property we're kind of, right, so premise one, f is really a kind of property variable, right? And the property we're plugging in is necessarily being identical to x. And that's the way we're getting this sort of cheap and cheery substitution in that case. It is dirty logical trickery of the highest order, but it's pretty fucking clever. So, cool, that settles it, right? Identity claims, if they're true, they're necessary. Let me give you a reason to think that we should probably doubt this argument. Right? Well, a philosophical upshot first. One philosophical upshot of this is that theoretical identity claims turn out to be necessarily true. Right? So for example, Nathan's pain is identical to this state in Nathan's brain. If that's true, then it turns out to be necessarily true. Right? Physicalism isn't just true, but it's necessarily true. Or water is H2O. This doesn't look just true, but necessarily so, if the argument to the previous slide works. So there's some pretty heavy-duty kind of upshots, reasons to be worried. So here's the reason to be worried. And it's an argument from Alan Gibbard. He is the reason to be worried. He's coming for you. Right? So Gibbard's argument turns on a clay statue. So let's call the statue Goliath. So this is Goliath of rock, right? And let's call the clay that makes Goliath up Lumpel. Right? So Goliath is the statue. Lumpel is the clay that composes Goliath. And let's suppose, it's not really going to work for this, but there's a weird kind of scenario where Lumpel and Goliath, in fact, entirely spatiotemporally coincide. So that is, right, our sculptor is extremely skillful. And they have a big block of clay. And they very deftly kind of move their little wire thing through the block of clay in such a way that Lumpel is extracted from the larger bit. Lumpel comes into existence in the exact shape of Goliath. So Lumpel exists at every point in time that Goliath exists. And vice versa. Well, in those cases, it's very natural to say they're identical. Right? If they exist all and only at the same times. Whenever you point at both. Right? There's no point in time where they come apart. It's very sensible to say Lumpel and Goliath are the same thing. So far, so good? You can see where the contingency is going to come in. Right? So in fact, they're identical because their whole existence is perfectly temporally and spatially coinciding. The problem is they don't necessarily coincide. In fact, this is where we can come back to questions about persistence, right? Goliath, being a statue, arguably doesn't survive losing its shape. If you just smash it back down to a blob, it's no longer the statue of Goliath. But Lumpel is the kind of thing that survives being smashed because Lumpel's just a lump of clay. So this means that you could have Lumpel and Goliath come into existence at the same time, and then you drop it. And Goliath ceases to be, but Lumpel's still around. Now, why does this matter? Well, if it's possible for Lumpel to continue to exist and Goliath to not, then the identity claim is merely contingent. In the case where they perfectly overlap, they're identical. In the case where we drop the statue and Lumpel's around and Goliath isn't, they're not identical anymore.
But that's the problem with
The diachronic identity.
Yeah.
Well, the nice thing is we can also think about it as a synchronic problem. Right? Because if something's necessarily true, and it's true in every possible situation, it should also be true at every given time. Because if it's possible for it to be false at a time, then let's just take that moment in time and have that be a possible scenario. Looks like it's not necessarily true anymore. Right? So, necessary true entails true at all moments, eternally true. So again, the upshot of this case, the Lumpel and Goliath case, is it looks like, in fact, they are actually identical, but it's possible that they're not. So either Goliath and Lumpel's identity is a contingent, truth, right? Could be true, could be false, or the identity claim was just false in the first place. So do we see this sort of structure of the puzzle? Again, note the tension here is really interesting because, to go back a few slides, we have this argument which is lovely and actually incredibly simple. And this entails that identity claims featuring names is necessarily true if true. But this case suggests that there's possible scenarios where you have a true identity claim, Goliath is Lumpel, that are merely contingently the case. So what can we do in response to this Goliath-Lumpel case? Right? Well, really the two options are the ones we've got listed here. Either we embrace contingentism, or we deny identity. So, to put another way, the two options here are often called one and two thingism. So called because it's a question of, when you look at Goliath and Lumpel, how many things are there? One thingism says there's only one thing there. They're identical. But the identification is contingent. And the advantage of this view is it fits with a really natural claim, which is that you can never have more than one thing in entirely the same place at the same time. At least no physical objects. Goliath and Lumpel are both physical objects. But of course, then they have to say what's wrong with that kind of Marcus Kripke argument. And that's hard, because there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. They maybe have to give up on this. The other way to go is two-thingism. You say, okay, cool. No, right? The identity claim isn't contingent because the identity claim was false the whole time. Lumpel and Goliath are not numerically identical. They are just spatiotemporally co-located. There are always two things there. But of course, this flies in the face of this intuitive idea that you could have two physical objects in entirely the same place at the same time. That's really weird. And to maybe make it even worse, we can ask this kind of question, right? So Lumpel can survive being squashed. Goliath cannot. So what explains this difference in modal properties? Why is possibly Lumpel survives true, but possibly Goliath survives false? So not only do we have to deal with this overlap, perfect overlap, but we also need to explain why the difference in modality comes up.
So according to the law of indissolubility, right? If we find one property is distinct, then there's no identity, and therefore, since the guy can survive and Goliath can't.
Yeah.
So it's pretty easily detectable.
This is basically running through the argument for two, right? Look, one can survive and the other can't. That's why they must not be identical in the first place, right? Yeah, that's a cool, quick, dirty argument for two-thingism. But then, of course, again, we need to say, right, what was wrong with the idea of this? Hey, if they're perfectly coincidental, why think there's two in the first place? One worry there, to really drive it home, is it might turn out that all of us are, in fact, constantly overlapping with billions upon billions of different objects. Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
Can potentialities be properties?
Yeah. They have to be. And in fact, we know why, because to go back to the argument here, we used this necessity claim. So modal properties, things like being necessarily self-identical, are fair game. So is possibly surviving. So again, you get this really fun tension. Right? We can either say the identity claim is in fact contingent. So you have cases with proper names where the identity claim isn't necessarily true, but it could be false. Or protect the necessity of identity by multiplying entities. And I guess the really cool thing about these two options, weirdly, is it ties back to the stuff we started the second half of the course with. This is yet another instance of increase ontology at the kind of simplicity of ideology, or increase ideology for the simplicity of ontology. One thing, but now identity needs to be contingent. Two things. Okay, cool. Well, now we've got no problem with making sense of this, but we're going to have to explain away why it is we have these multiple objects and potentially really explode our ontology. So it's a nice little way to kind of tie back to some of the stuff we've done. So, again, that kind of last bit here, when we think about the modal status of an identity claim, it's very obvious it can be contingent when we have, say, definite descriptions on both sides, or a proper name and a definite description. Again, just think of Armstrong, the first man on the moon, right? But when we think about identity claims featuring two proper names and the modal status of those, we run into this kind of two-pronged problem. There's the Bark and Marcus Kripke argument, and there's this case from Gibbard with Lumpel and Goliath. Reasons to go one way or the other. Cool. So that's really the stuff I wanted to cover. The next thing, as I mentioned at the kind of top, for some kind of personal reasons, I won't be able to be here for next week's lecture. But the study guide has already been uploaded to the Canvas page. Again, to stress, nothing that isn't on the study guide will be on the exam, right? only the stuff that's on those, I guess, 2 or 3 pages is going to be up for possible questions. Only seems fair. There's a bunch of stuff in some of the slides that we just didn't cover. I've tried to make that clear in the recordings and things. I think I've said explicitly, like, not going to ask you about this. That's sticking to that. So for the tutorial on Friday, I'm going to talk about some of the questions. I don't know why it says it will be uploaded this afternoon. They're already there. We'll talk about some of the questions from this. We'll also, if we have some time, talk about any questions people have from the final exam. I'll try and also upload a kind of, well, I won't try. I will upload a little brief recording talking about the structure of the exam, highlighting anything, stuff like that. Look into possibly having an online session next Friday. Not in 2 days, but the one after. As a kind of review. So I'll make an announcement about that. But yeah, thank you guys very much. Have a lovely, lovely rest of the week, and we'll see you all on Friday.